You enjoyed your lunch. I certainly did, especially the forest after. Very beautiful place. So this morning we had an extremely productive session, I would say. We learned about the importance of this project for different participants. We learned about examples from different countries, from which are definitely valuable to all of the participants and to us in our design. And this afternoon, in the first session, we're going to focus on research and best practice. And as part of that, we're going to have 3 speakers, and followed by a panel discussion. Our first speaker is going to be Chris from OECD, who's going to talk about our approach to research and regional and rural development and how that links to indigenous communities. After that, we're going to have another colleague from the lead unit, Jonathan Barr, who's going to talk about designing local employment and skill policies from his own implementation of projects. And then we're going to finish with Dawn, who's going to talk about indigenous research institutions. So, Chris, you have 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
I'll be quick. So, again, as Anna said, this is about how we look at the world, I suppose, in terms of regional economic development and how that links with Indigenous communities. So, first of all, I'll just talk a bit about how we think about regional economic performance in the context of national economic performance and our framework for thinking about development. Then some observations from work that we've done in relation to Indigenous communities and some of the policy implications of that. So in terms of regions and why they're important to national growth, so this chart shows the contribution of different regions in the OECD to the total growth of the OECD in the period of 1997 to 2007. And so what you see on the left-hand side, sorry if I can get this pointer working up there, is you see there's a few regions which make a big contribution to growth. So these are regions like Paris and London and so forth. And then on this fat tail, there's a lot of other regions in the OECD which make us, on their own, a very small contribution to growth. Our argument is that amongst these very small regions, if you can improve their performance, you'll make a big impact on overall growth outcomes. So if you're a country, you can't just focus on your big cities. You also need to focus on regions outside of your big cities, particularly in the rural areas. And if you can get them growing stronger collectively, then you're going to make a bigger impact on national economic performance. Now, when we actually look at regional performance across the OECD, and we recently released a report on this, and what this chart shows is it's a measure of inequality between regions and countries within the OECD. And what it shows on the dotted line is that you have less inequality in per capita incomes between countries. So you're actually seeing convergence in per capita incomes between countries in the OECD in the period 1995 to 2013. But when we look inside countries, we can actually see that inequalities are increasing. So you're not seeing the same convergence within countries. And I think this makes it's common sense to all people. You sort of make an observation that, you know, in places like the United States or the United Kingdom, you can see increasing inequalities between regions, and that then is having some kind of effect on the political system as well. You're seeing some feedback in the political system of those countries. So it's bad from a political economy point of view, but it's also bad because these lagging regions, these regions that are falling further behind, they're actually a great source of growth. If you can get growth dynamics working properly in these regions, there's actually a lot of potential for them to catch up to the wealthier ones. And this growth dynamic is not working properly in OECD countries. So what we did is some analysis of why that is occurring, particularly in the rural areas. And so we looked at rural areas that were, in terms of their productivity and performance, ones that were falling behind, ones which were catching up. And we looked at the different factors which were associated with that. And there were 2 key factors which we found. One was when you looked at rural economies, the proportion of those economies made up of tradable activities. So industries in those places that were involved in export and import dynamics, basically. So this enables them to increase productivity because they're linked into global value chains. So this is an important observation for rural economies. The other is about their access to cities, which is an indication of their access to markets. So some kind of either proximity to cities or some kind of basic level of density within rural places is also important to growth. So in terms of what that means in relation to policy, there's a couple of key implications. One is in rural areas is understanding what your assets are. We talked a bit about that before. You have to understand what you're good at relative to other regions, and then finding a niche in relation to that. So what is your particular niche in a global market related to those assets? And those assets might be related to minerals, they might be related to food production, they may be related to tourism. Then working with entrepreneurs and firms involved in those activities to build their capacity, build their productivity, to help them access markets. The other part is then also in terms of linkage to cities is managing those linkages and expanding those linkages between rural areas and cities. And then some other policies there around addressing disadvantage and inequality and issues around climate change as well. So in terms of why Indigenous communities are important relative to this, these observations and this framework that I just talked about. And these are issues that we've talked through today. Obviously, first of all, is this connection to land is very important. So if you're looking at rural economies, land obviously is a major resource in rural economies, and across many countries that have an Indigenous population, they either have ownership rights over land or they use land. There's also the knowledge that they have about the land, and it's related in terms of how to manage water and land resources, and also adapt to climate change. This is a key asset. The second thing is related to that, then there are economic activities which leverage those assets. And we've talked about them today around ecotourism, around food and agriculture. And these activities are actually tradable activities. They have a basis for export. So therefore, they're very important to rural economies. The other part is that when you look at rural areas in Canada or in Australia, the Indigenous population is growing faster than the non-Indigenous population. So again, this is an important source of demand for services in those areas. But as we've discussed, there are these barriers to them participating in the economy. So again, if you look at the positive side of that, that is a latent area of potential for growth in rural areas. So we've just done some basic work looking at who are Indigenous people, how many live in the OECD and in non-OECD countries. I think we just put that up there just to show that it's an important issue to a number of different countries, and also that indicating in the project itself that we will develop a chapter which looks at these precisely at these issues about defining Indigenous people, again, how many there are, where they live, and the nature of their participation in the economy as well. It's just some of the partner countries. So then we've started to dig into the literature a little bit, and again, these reflect themes that we've been talking about today. So over the last 30 to 40 years, there's been a shift to self-determination, which is in a practical sense reflected into self-governance of communities. This is linked to the struggle for land rights, and that there are variations obviously between countries in terms of how that is reflected in the legislative framework. In countries like Canada and Australia, it's recognised as a national priority because of the inequalities and also this increasing recognition of the discrimination which has occurred, institutional discrimination. And then a policy shift, again, which we've been talking about, much more towards how you mobilise and unlock the potential of Indigenous communities in terms of land assets, access to financing, etc. And so a lot of policy innovations across countries in terms of helping to make this happen. In terms of the work that we've done, I mentioned a bit of this before. We've done a number of different reviews, mainly in Latin America, which has, and what this slide identifies as some of the key themes related to that. So one is, again, this issue of inequality, which tends to be worse in rural and remote areas. There's a challenging institutional context indicated by a lack of trust in government institutions. Often, in terms of the multi-level governance, you have a strong relationship with a single agency at the national level, which might be responsible for Indigenous affairs, but not strong relationships with other ministries, nor strong relationships within regions with municipalities and with regional governments. And so this creates a bit of a mess in terms of the governance arrangements around Indigenous economic development, which again is also then reflected in a lack of coherence in terms of how policies are implemented for communities. And the other issue there that we have also picked up in our studies is the lack of data that communities have about their economies, and the lack of capacity to use that data, which again is an important precondition for participating in the development process. So again, the implications that we would draw from this work, and I think these are some of the ideas that we would like to develop in the project. Number one, probably the most important, is increasing access to markets for Indigenous entrepreneurs, businesses in rural areas. The reforms to multi-level governance are very important. So how do you decentralise? How do you decentralise in an asymmetric way, which means that you don't decentralise in a one-size-fits-all way, because Indigenous communities and their governance are very different. They each have different capacities. So the way governments do those reforms need to recognise that. I think looking at the issues around land, so how you reform the governance of land and the regulatory frameworks around it to enable development, appropriate forms of development to occur. And then very important issues around capacity building. So how do you foster leadership? How do you build organisational capacity to support self-governance? Because again, if the ideas around self-determination are operationalised, they depend on effective governance at the local level, at the community level. And in terms of, I guess, a nice way to finish is how we think about rural development. So what I've put up is our rural paradigm, our rural 3.0. It's not because there was a 2.0, it's because the 3 is reflected in the different dimensions. So we have the 3 dimensions of economy, society, and the environment. We have 3 different types of rural inside functional economic areas, rural close to cities, rural remote. The 3 different sectors in terms of the public sector, the private sector, and the third sector. But I think, again, we've talked about this place-based approach, but I mean, we've been developing this framework in the OECD now for probably 20 years. And I think the important point is that it's really based on this bottom-up view of development, that local communities need to take ownership of their development vision and strategy, and then governments need to work beside and enable that vision as well. And that the way in which policies are delivered need to be tailored to the circumstances of different places. And we think that this framework is one which is well suited to Indigenous economic development, and I guess in a sense in this project we want to adapt this framework to the realities of implementing better policies for Indigenous communities in a rural and regional context. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. So as Chris mentioned, we have experience with territorial and rural reviews, but the organization has also done work with Indigenous communities before on more thematic themes like education, natural resource extraction, and of course skills, which we're going to hear more about locally from Jonathan, that could join us here, has dealt with this topic firsthand, so he's going to walk us through his experience and see what we can learn from.
Okay, great. Thanks, Anna, for the introduction. Thank you. So a bit about me. I'm Jonathan Barr. I'm actually Canadian. I'm from Cambridge, Ontario. You probably think there's a lot of Canadians that work for the OECD, given that 2 of the 4 on the team are from Canada, but there's not that many Canadian nationals within the OECD. I come from a division called the Local Employment and Economic Development Program. Chris explained at the beginning that the OECD, where our governance structure is managed by committees. So we have the Regional Development Policy Committee, but we also have the Local Employment and Economic Development Committee. And it's comprised of the 35 members, primarily from national employment ministries and national economic development ministries. So that's who I'm reporting to. And I'm managing a unit within the program that deals with employment and skills policies. And we come at it very much from this place-based perspective and how you bridge education and employment systems to get people into better quality work. So what I'm going to do is highlight some of the work we've done, and actually a project that we're implementing right now in Canada in partnership with Employment and Social Development Canada, as well as in Australia with the Department of Employment. So, we've looked at some data around employment and skills outcomes, and what we're trying to do within my unit is collect kind of basic data that we can on skills outcomes and on employment outcomes across different countries. We have a challenge because we know that collecting data on Indigenous peoples is challenging, related to self-identification issues and definition issues, and then even coming up with consistent indicators that we can collect across the countries of the OECD is challenging. But here we see, we've collected data for Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the US, and we see, a gap in terms of Indigenous outcomes versus non-Indigenous people as it relates to the percentage of the population with post-secondary education and employment rates. And employment rates reflect how you're using your population and how many people are participating in the labor market. So what we've done in terms of previous work is we actually, we published a study in 2015 that was done in partnership with Employment and Social Development Canada and with INAC within the framework of these country reviews that we were doing on local job creation. And in Canada, we looked at the Yukon and Saskatchewan, and we looked at First Nations communities as case studies. So in Dawson City, we looked at the Trondike-Gwich'in First Nation community, and near Saskatoon, we looked at Whitecap First Nation in Saskatchewan. And we came across some very interesting lessons, which I just wanted to briefly highlight. And I would encourage everybody to download and read this report. We actually get paid on the number of downloads, so the more you download, the better. I mean, one of the big things, and it's something that's been emerging from the discussions this morning, is this issue of leadership. And particularly in the Yukon, where I think there's about 11 First Nations communities that have self-governing agreements. And one of the really interesting examples we came across was at Yukon College in Dawson City, where they have a First Nations governance and public administration program. And what it's trying to do is train Indigenous leaders to take on these new responsibilities with self-government. And they have different modules on community and economic development, as well as human resources management. And so we've highlighted that in our report as a very good example. And that's the idea with this report, is we were trying to highlight good examples across Canada. And so the issue around employment and skills as well came up. So the Trondike-Gwich'in First Nation was focusing a lot on apprenticeships. And what they were doing is they were working with local employers to keep the logs of the apprentices and help with some of the administration to help apprentices participate in training programs and ensure that they complete their training. And another big thing, or theme that came across, was this notion of community-led economic development. So particularly the Whitecap First Nation, the chief there, Darcy Bear, is a very charismatic guy. And he's done a lot around this, and they've created the Whitecap Development Corporation, which is very focused on attracting inward investments into the community. And what they've done is they've taken 1,000 hectares of reserve lands for commercial development and negotiating to bring employers into the community. So they're creating new revenue streams by doing this through land leases and property taxes. And when we spoke with the chief, he mentioned that about 600 people from the community have now been employed as a result of these community economic development initiatives, which is very interesting to come across. And we've highlighted, we have lots of other examples, and I'll talk about a few of them. But so, I mean, this was really an impetus for us to start doing more work. So within the context of our directing committee, we were requested by Employment and Social Development Canada and the Department of Employment Australia to do more studies and more in-depth work. So we're undertaking sort of a phase 2 of this work. And these are sort of the main topics we're looking at. So boosting employment. So, you know, thinking about how do you match people to better jobs? What's the role of employment services? What's the role of on-reserve and off-reserve employment services? Improving education and skills outcomes. So how do you improve the overall orientation of the education and training system to make sure that it's matching people to employers in a local community? We're looking at SME and entrepreneurship policies. So how do you promote job creation by stimulating more Indigenous entrepreneurship policies? And then the local governance. So we're looking at this mix between national and local, and how national policies can be designed in a manner which rewards more local innovation. And so that's a key theme of our approach. And just in terms of, so we're also taking a case study approach under our project, and this is just to focus on the 2 jurisdictions. So the reason why I'm even here is I was actually in Calgary and Winnipeg last week. We were doing a workshop in Calgary as part of the Economus, the Community Economic Development Network, on this project. And then we were in Winnipeg meeting with the Center for Aboriginal Human Resources Development. So there are 2, we also in Calgary met Community Futures Treaty 7. And they're 2 of the areas we're looking at. We're really, within the Canadian study, focusing on the implementation of the Assets Program, or the Aboriginal Skills and Employment Training Strategy. So that's a real key focus for us. So the case study areas we're looking at are very much service delivery organizations. So we're also going to be looking in New Brunswick and Thunder Bay at the Mattawa Employment and Training Center. And so this time around, we've met with Community Futures Treaty 7 and the Center for Aboriginal Human Resources Development. We're going to come back and meet with the other 2 case study areas on another trip. In Australia, we're focusing very much on urban job active providers. So in Australia, their employment services system, they contract out to providers through a private market model, and they're in the process of reviewing their employment services framework, and they're very much seeking our advice, really exclusively focused on urban Indigenous people about how employment services can be designed in a better way. And we actually had a delegate from the Department of Employment Australia was accompanying us for our meetings last week to learn about the good things that are happening in Canada. So this is just an overview of the current planned activities. We're doing data collection. We're also doing a literature review and the deep dive case studies that I mentioned. So there's the workshop schedule. And actually, this is just a photo from the Calgary workshop that we had last Wednesday. We'll also be participating. We're organizing jointly with Chris an internal OECD workshop in November, where we're seeking to raise internal awareness within the OECD and really bridge a number of directorates that have been working on this. And in Australia, we're going to be having a workshop in March 2018 on this project. And so the 2 outputs for this project are 2 draft country reports that we'll be producing. So I just wanted to highlight just some of the findings that we've come up with, looking more specifically at Canada and highlighting some of the things we heard this week through our different, or last week, sorry, I should say, through the different bilateral meetings we've had. So we've been looking at microdata, comparing Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations in Canada. And so here we've looked at employment rates. You know, as Chris mentioned, one of the arguments, at least in Canada, is, you know, there's a social argument for better integrating Indigenous peoples, but there's also the economic argument. And that is, in Canada, with an aging workforce, you need to better utilize the skills of the existing labor force. And Indigenous people's skills are very much underutilized. So improving their outcomes will improve the overall economic outcomes of Canada. And so here you look at trends between male and female, looking at the Indigenous and non-Indigenous population. And it's interesting because you actually see that female Indigenous tended to trail, but they've actually been catching up between 2015 and 2016, which is a positive sign in terms of the data. Of course, this data doesn't capture on-reserve populations. It's subject to self-identification. So, this is based on the limitations. This is what we're seeing. And we've also looked at labor force participation rates, and we see that certain provinces have better outcomes than others. So, Alberta, for example, the labor force participation rate is about 73%, British Columbia about 73.2%, and the Atlantic region about 70%. And if you look at gaps in terms of labor force participation, you see Quebec amongst the highest in terms of the difference between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous population. So we're also coming at it from this urban lens. And so this is data looking at the percentage of the population with tertiary education, so post-secondary educational attainment. And you see that in cities, there are these large gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations. And we see about 40% of the population has no certificate. And it was interesting because one of the examples previously we looked at in Whitecap, what they did is they used to operate their primary education schooling. And then after grade 6, all of their students went into the Saskatoon high school system, and they were getting very poor outcomes. So the Chief Darcy Bear actually negotiated an agreement with the Saskatoon Board of Education to integrate their primary schooling into the public school system, and saw very good outcomes by coming to this agreement and aligning the delivery of programs. And actually having this created a network of teachers between non-Indigenous and Indigenous people. And this very much improved the success rates and the graduation rates. And it was something that was cited to us in our previous study as a very good example in terms of aligning with the public school system. Of course, we also met last week with an elder with Blackfoot First Nation. His name's Roy Bearchief. And he had a really great line. He said that education is the new buffalo. And so one of the things that he highlighted to us is that in Canada with the residential school system, there's been a lot of sort of significant challenges with getting Indigenous people into education. So he went back and did a master's, I think, at 55, and now he's working in his community and doing mentorship and promoting the benefits of this. And so this is something that was quite interesting, just talking to him about and this role of mentorship and having elders and older, influencing the parents to get people to complete education. So one of the other things is we're focusing on entrepreneurship. So, and this is an area where I think I'd actually even appreciate advice from around the table of where we can look at data, because it's something we're struggling in terms of Canada, collecting good data and recent data in terms of entrepreneurship and SMEs within the Indigenous population. So here we've looked at a study that was done by the National Aboriginal Capital Corporations and the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, and this is some of the data that we've come across. So 38,000 Indigenous entrepreneurs in 2011, many located off reserve, but we predominantly see employment in lower value-added sectors. And so that's a challenge, I think. And of course, about 60% are sole proprietorships. So this means it's literally one person operating a business. So this is just some key data to think about. And again, we'd appreciate your advice on other data that we should look at. Unemployment rates. So we're looking at cities, and here you see census metropolitan areas in Canada, 2011 data. I mean, it's interesting looking at this that you actually see Montreal where there is no significant gap in terms of the Indigenous and non-Indigenous population. And I'd be interested to hear views around the table of why that's the case, because we see with other cities in Canada that there's a fairly significant gap. So the one thing I wanted to highlight is just a very good example that we came across in Winnipeg, and that's the Centre for Aboriginal Human Resources Development. And I imagine it's probably a very good example across Canada, because what they've really done is design their services on this cradle to grave principle. So they're located in the city of Winnipeg. They've redesigned a former railway station, and they have the full suite of services, from housing to childcare to employment services to training. And what they're doing is they're working with local employers to get Indigenous people into higher value-added jobs. So they're really focused on aerospace, and they've actually got grants from the government, and they've designed teaching facilities with local employers in the aerospace sector to train people, machinists, CNC operators, to get people into good jobs. And I mean, it was just a really good example. We met with them on Friday in Winnipeg, and they were taking us through and gave us a tour of their facilities. And it's really, I think, a good example of this notion of it's really having the full suite of one-stop services. And I think that's something we'll be highlighting in our report as a really good example. So that's all from me. Yeah, thank you for the time and for listening.
Thank you, Jonathan. That was very interesting, especially because you take a comparative perspective on case studies, and we hope to extend this in our study, but also from an international perspective. So you already see in Canada, comparing places could highlight so many of the differences and give us guidance about these best practices. So we're hoping to continue this line of comparative studies in our work in the report, including many different regions in the participant countries. And just to close the part of speakers of this session, we have Don, who is going to talk about the Indigenous research institutions in Canada. So, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to also comment on a couple of things that Jonathan had just shared, and you definitely have been able to find a lot of those stars out there that are doing some amazing things. And I think of the Whitecap Dakota First Nation and Chief Darcy Bear, and I was just talking with him last week. And for the education system, he was telling me that they just recently, last week, opened a new school in the city of Saskatoon. It's owned by the First Nation. There's 700 students, and 10% of the students are from the First Nation, because they have a small First Nation population. So when you think about that, 630 of the students are not First Nation primarily, and what they've done is incorporated a whole new curriculum to teach about Indigenous people in Canada. And he showed me some photos, and you could see the photos of a lot of the historic and current figures of Indigenous leaders and what they've done. And there's teachings all throughout the design of the new school. So it's a really amazing concept, turning things around and looking at it the other way, instead of just sending the kids to a school, making sure that the First Nation own it and having a say on the curriculum. So I think that that's great. And I was looking at your reports from the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. I know I got a copy of their the 2016 Aboriginal Business Survey, so I'm not sure if that's the one that you took. Yeah. So I think they just came out. So you can check with them on the updated stats I just received yesterday myself, which I think are helpful to our discussions here as well in your research. I know I'm here to speak about one of the research institution. I have to tell you, it's yet to be established, but I spoke about it or introduced it earlier today. And I mentioned how the chiefs in our region have come together and given us direction as an organization, an Aboriginal financial institution, on things that we need to focus on. And our region includes Canada's mining cluster in the Sudbury area. That's the biggest mining center for goods and services and expertise in the mining industry. And many of the people in that region travel throughout the world to train others, to promote the new technologies that they've developed. And it is a real mining center. And again, our communities were on the outside of the circle. We were looking outside that circle. We weren't part of it. So now when our communities looked at this this idea of mining, and we really want to have some say, because there are some areas in many areas where we want to make sure that the water is protected, all over the world really, but that the water is protected, that there's minimal disruption to the natural ecological systems in our area. We have been had environmental issues in the areas you can imagine over the years. But there's been work on trying to mitigate that, and I think involving Indigenous peoples will be helpful to that. But in our mining strategy, which we took around to all of the communities, to our regions, and brought in community members to have some input. What would they like to see? Well, how should we be involved in this industry? And there were several recommendations in this strategy, with one being that they wanted to have a place to go for information on to get resource people who can help, some expertise who can help the communities. They wanted to have a place where they can find templates for leading practices in the industry for Indigenous people. They wanted to have a place that can provide introductory training on the industry and to keep the communities apprised of what was going on. So we looked at this as a possible center of excellence for Indigenous mineral development. So to date, I wanted to let you know that, oh, I should mention that the center, we saw it not just as an advantage to Indigenous people, but it's an advantage also and a benefit for government and the industry. Because for industry, they don't know sometimes who they need to speak to. They don't know who to talk to there or what the protocols are in working with Indigenous people. You know, there's not really one place you can find that out, and even if you Google it in our area. So we tried to say, well, this is something that'll also benefit everybody if the industry is knowledgeable about what the protocols are and who they need to speak to when they're looking at development. And it's also, as we know in Canada here, we have a law that there's a duty for the governments to consult with and accommodate Indigenous people on any development. It's a Supreme Court ruling that we had, and the federal and provincial and municipal governments are required to, by this duty, to consult with us and to accommodate our interests. Right now, it didn't. There's always the discussion. We feel it also means that they need to obtain our consent, more so than just consulting and accommodating, but receiving our consent to do any development. And so there's been that kind of struggle on that side of things. But in the meantime, we feel that having a center like this would be helpful to all the parties involved in this industry. So we spoke to the local university, and the university already is quite involved in the mining industry through hosting geology programs and research. They already house a center of excellence for mining innovation on the university premises. There's the Goodman School of Mines that does research as well, that's located on the university premises. So we talked to them, and there's support for the establishment of this Center of Excellence for Indigenous mining, mineral, I should say, development. And by having it located at the university, we would be able to have a lot of the students do the research that we need, which is what the other two organizations do as well. They have they call on the university students and professors to help with research projects. We think this would be a big help to us, so we thought it was very important to be associated with a university through this center. The other thing is we brought together a steering committee made up primarily of Indigenous people working in the mining industry in some way, whether it's a business or a community that has agreements with the mining industry, We included the Center of Excellence on Mining Innovation as part of our steering committee. We have people who have worked in, who are actually the Canadian Aboriginal Minerals Association. I keep saying mining, it's minerals. Association is also on our steering committee. So we have some really good expertise around the development of this new center. And we have in place a business plan that we developed with the consulting group MNP. And the business plan was funded through Indigenous and Northern Affairs Canada. And that business plan has been given to the provincial and federal governments, as well as some of the big mining companies in the region. And it outlines how they would financially support this center to get it started, to develop this database of information. It's not a big, huge entity. It's 3 people, a main executive director who's knowledgeable about the mining industry and already has a network. We have a key research person and an administrative research assistant. So it's not a huge cost, but the benefits of having such an entity are just, we foresee as being very, very valuable. So we've received positive comments back from the different levels of government, and we're still working with the mining companies for them to understand the value of such an entity. In the Sudbury region, they're looking at having it recognized as a formal mining cluster, and they're involving Indigenous people as part of the oversight committee for this mining cluster as well. So I think this will be something that I'm hoping as we go forward, where we've been doing everything in the planning and building the expertise and capacity, but I think it'll be something that will be beneficial for sure. And having that clearinghouse of information, we already, through Wabautek, we've been collecting a lot of the templates for the stronger impact and benefit agreements that have been developed. We've been collecting templates on strong First Nation protocols for consultation and accommodation and consent. So we're putting all of this together. We're hoping that the center can just coordinate or facilitate the annual mining roundtables involving government, industry, and the Indigenous people, so that there would be a chance for face-to-face discussions in the roundtable. So, and also this center will be doing things like showing what the employment opportunities, business procurement opportunities are that are available in the industry as well. So we're trying to open those kinds of doors. But the main thing is to be that clearinghouse of information. And I think that that's so much needed, as I mentioned earlier today. It's I think an entity that'll help communities to make informed decisions, because as I mentioned, we have had communities inundated with technical data that they didn't understand. And so when you have that kind of information, you're automatically going to say no. Or if you look at that information, you can assess, well, maybe you should do it this way. Maybe this will save the environment in this way, or, there's an opportunity there once people are all educated and at the same level around the table in that circle. I just wanted to comment also briefly on just again for Jonathan on training. I wanted to mention a training initiative that we've been involved in for 8 years, where we hire, train, and place Indigenous youth to become market ready for jobs and different kinds of jobs. What we have done is we usually we bring about 60 youth in every year to receive certified training in things like customer service, workplace safety, food handling, first aid, smart serve, so that within 1 week, usually it takes for this training, the certified training, those youth have more certifications than most adults in our region, Indigenous or non-Indigenous. Then we also infuse traditional teachings, personal budgeting, workplace ethics as part of that training as well. The traditional teachings is the really valuable part of that whole session. And then an additional week on entrepreneurship. So they gain entrepreneurship skills. Then we find jobs in the area of their interest, if they're interested in law, if they're interested in doing environmental assessments, if they're interested in working in the hospitality industry. We find them job placements for 6 weeks, and we pay for their wage subsidy. And after 8 years, we found that those youth that we had in that program, we also take them on a career trip to Sudbury to look at jobs in the local regional hospital and the mines and the trades businesses. So we expose them to things that they would not necessarily see every day outside of their communities. The Northern Ontario School of Medicine, take them there. So this exposure has allowed them to see other opportunities that exist. And what we did is we tracked where those youth are, and we found that 93% of them completed high school, with the majority going on to post-secondary. That number was in the low 60s before we started doing this training. So it's exposing the young people to other types of jobs, because we used to ask them at the beginning, what kind of job would you like to see? And they always saw jobs just within their community that existed there, because that's all they were exposed to. Now they could see jobs in the wider world that they could take on as well. So I wanted to mention that as also when you're looking at the labor, that there's, it's important to start with that age and to look at ways while they're still in school of opening the doors for them to other job opportunities. I don't know if anyone has any questions, but I'd be pleased to address those. Thank you.
Thank you, Dawn. Very interesting. You share your vision of your dream or what has to become, and I think there's a very important step, and everybody's learning a lot from this. And as part of that, you mentioned, well, how important knowledge is for informed decision, but I think I speak for my colleagues as well that do work on research from this other side of the pond. We face a lot of difficulties with accessing data about what actually Indigenous people do. So to get this panel discussion started, I wanted to ask you, and a representative of Indigenous communities from Sweden, if you have thought about establishing sort of observatories for Indigenous economic development, some sort of institution or a way to collect data in a more systematic way, so that we, as policy evaluators, can use this information to help design policies. Because at the moment we rely a lot on either national sources like censuses that a lot of the time don't go into detail and miss a lot of the things that are happening at the local level, or we rely on very outdated information in a lot of cases. This is especially the case for countries like Colombia, where the last census was in 2005, I was just telling before. So We are very excited about proposing better policies, identifying opportunities, but as we don't live in these communities, we rely only on secondary data sources. So coming back to Jonathan's point about the experiences, the challenges he faced with data collection in Canada, which we think we're going to face anyway with all the participant countries in our study. An important part of the study is also to propose ways to bridge this gap. And I want to learn from the perspective of you, from your communities, if you have thought about a way to bridge these information gaps between you and us on the other side.
Thank you very much for the statements. The situation are similar, is my response to the questions that can be raised now compared with how it is in Canada and compared with how it is in Sweden, because indigenous are a small number of the total inhabitants, and the official statistics doesn't show the indigenous problems or the indigenous as a number in the statistics. Most often it happens so that that the relevant statistics that are available says, no, we don't have any indigenous people here. We don't know where they are, but they don't come here for sure. And it can happen in unemployment rate or in the hospitals, or it can be in every official institution in Northern Sweden. And also the person who are working, the non-indigenous person who are working at Swedish institution or dealing with indigenous persons coming to enjoy the service of this institution are surprisingly much very, I would not say they are not ignorant, but they don't take the problem seriously, and their employer have not been helping them, giving them the tools so they can deal with the problems, and also to make sure that the indigenous peoples are shown in the statistics. And it's if you're not part of the statistics, then you will not get better funding for your part of the sector, your part of the field. It shows, among other things, in the healthcare, and the special rapporteur, UN Special Rapporteur Paul Hunt was visiting Sápmi on Swedish side for maybe 10 years ago, and he made it very visible that in the healthcare, the non-indigenous are unaware about this, and they don't take necessary precautions to change it to the better. Unfortunately, the Sámi Parliament has again been a failure in this field of interest, in this field of issue, and obviously we have been talking about other items or other field of interest and focus on them, but we are aware about it, and we are also aware about the importance to have indigenous scientists. It is utmost important to have indigenous scientists, especially when we know what the non-indigenous scientists have been doing for not so good scientific investigations for 50, 60 years ago. Today, it is very curious to understand that the non-indigenous scientists are very eager to find out about the health of bears, of the bear population, maybe in Laponia. But same scientists are not so interested to find out about the well-being of the Sámi individuals. So why? Because the bears are protected by international agreements that Sweden have made regarding flora and fauna. But Sweden have no obligations when it comes to human rights instrument or that affects the Sámi people in Sweden. And if they have so they are neglecting, then they are running away from their responsibility. I am happy to say that the Sámi Parliament have no legal possibility to change this, but we have the best possibility to change it because we can wake up the people opinion, and we have been doing so when it comes to the mineral policy that we adopted 4 years ago. It was sent a shockwave to the Swedish state institutions when it comes to mining, because they never expected us to be as bold and brave as we were 4 years ago. But this initiative or this kind of working manners from Sami Parliament side need to be taken also when it comes to information about the Sami in the official statistic, and it, when you turn on the radio in the morning and when you turn on the TV in the afternoon in what is called public service, those companies who have a duty to inform the public and have public service in agreement with the state, it is surprisingly often that you can't hear any indigenous music in the radio, even though you are in the northernmost country in Sweden, and it's very likely that you get to hear everything about what's happening in the United States and not anything of what's happened due to the Sami culture in northern Sweden. So and you cannot blame one single person for all this. It would have been very easy if we could have been blaming one person, but it's what is needed. It's a shift in 100 years of creating an unhealthy system, and it's creating an unhealthy system not only for indigenous, although indigenous are suffering quite much from it. Maybe we are suffering the most, but I will not argue about who is suffering most, but also the dominating society are suffering, and men and women in the dominating society are suffering. And one of the consequences is that women are moving from the northernmost county. They are moving away to southern Sweden, where they can get their needs more easily covered by culture, art, what they do like to have in their surroundings, which cannot be delivered in northern Sweden. And this kind of change, maybe it should be more feminine, maybe it should be more indigenous, and maybe the indigenous man should not be so stubborn or so easy to fool or trap into bad behavior or into domesticate to become like the non-indigenous, or at least to become like the state wants us to be. So the indigenous scientists, but who will teach the indigenous scientists? We also have several Sami institutions in Norway and Sweden, and they have been very, very good. And it was heard here that education is the new buffalo, and it is the new buffalo because we have, even though there is not any buffalo in Nordic countries, but we have experienced the gold mine it is to have an educational system that you don't need to explain to your teacher what you want to do as a student and what your wishes about the education are, because they are indigenous, they have experienced it, they have also had other students with a similar problem or with a similar opportunities. So it is very good, but also there is a problem with the society funding, because the number of participants, indigenous participants, are not as high, and therefore the funding can be not as good, and the opportunities or possibility to establish a university or a high school is not as good because the state have not taken into consideration any other method or any other society than what they already have established. This is also on behalf of the Sami Parliament to enlighten the members of the government and also the parliamentarians. But it's a very tricky since they are, even though if you are convincing them, one single person or maybe a group of persons are not the problem.